start the recording, please. Oh, that's already done. And then Adrienne, if you could take it away, introducing Vander tonight.
Sure. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Vander Viana. Dr. Vander Viana coordinates all the master's courses in the School of Education and Lifelong Learning and is the course director of the Masters in Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages. Some of his research interests are in corpus linguistics and in English language teacher education. He's the founder of the Language in Education Research Group and is the principal investigator of two funded projects, Gendering in LT and the LIT Educational Hub. He's the lead author of Corpus Linguistics for English of Academic Purposes, which is to be out into 2022. So Professor Vander Viana, thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. And it will be a pleasure to attend your talk, which the title of your talk is The Interface Between Corpus Linguistics and English for Academic Purposes, What, How, and Why. Thank you very much for being here today with us, and we are all ears.
That's great. Thank you very much, Adriani. Thank you, Peter, for that. And, well, I would like to start by thanking Peter, Adriani, and Paula for organizing this brilliant series and also for having me here. I'm delighted to be here today with you. I'll do my best to follow Peter's excellent lead last week. But before we get started, we are in this kind of new normal where I'm talking to apparently 80 people, but I mean, I can't see you or I can't have you in the same room. You started actually to do what I was going to ask you to do first, just to get started. If you could go to the chat box and type the city and country where you are joining us today, that would be great. So that means we get to know a bit more about you and where you're joining us from. Wow, we just see the number of places that we've got from Lithuania, Australia, Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey. Keep going. That's excellent to know. I mean, China, Algeria. So good morning to those of you who are in Brazil, in the Brazil time zone or thereabouts. Good afternoon for those of you who are around the UK. And good evening for those of you who are further afield. That's great to see you all here. Thank you very much for coming and thank you for joining us. Hello, Tatiana, nice to see you here. So I'm joining you today from Norwich. And I think I saw someone saying it's also, he or she is also joining from Norwich. So thank you for joining from Norwich. If you have never been to Norwich, I thought I should perhaps just share with you some pictures of what Norwich looks like. It is a city in the east of England, and I generally describe it as a very peaceful coexistence of historical buildings and modern architecture, as you can see on the both right-hand side of your picture and on the left-hand side of your picture. So on the right, you've got the cathedral, well, actually one of the cathedrals we've got in Norwich. We have actually two cathedrals in this city. And on the left-hand side, you see the forum, which is where the library is based, the BBC is based, restaurants and cafes. And there are green areas all over the city. So as Adriana was saying earlier on, I am based at the University of East Anglia, which is the one where you can see on your picture on your screen right now. All this middle area that you see of buildings in here, these white buildings in the middle, is part of the university, including the green area around it, the field track and the lake on the right-hand side. For those of you who are based in Norwich, or for those of you who have come in here, it's a lovely campus, and I hope that means someday you can come and visit us in person when the conditions allow us to do that. So at the university, as Adriani was saying, I lead the Language and Education Research Group. I coordinate the masters in our School of Education and Lifelong Learning, and I have special oversight. I'm the course director for the masters in teaching English to speakers of other languages. I also teach on what we call the MASLE, the second language education, and work with PhD students in the field of applied linguistics and TESOL. So this is just a brief introduction of where I am and what I do over here. So if we now think about what we're going to be doing in the session, it was very difficult to try and think how to plan this session because I did not know exactly who you would be. Obviously, I mean, Peter provided us with an excellent brief of who might be here, but it's difficult to think of who would actually turn up and what you would know already about EAP and Corpus Linguistics. So I decided to make an assumption that meant potentially you might be a student. So you might be doing your master's or your PhD. You might also have teaching experience. You might have done EAP teaching in your life. You might have done years of EAP teaching in your life. And perhaps you might have done research in EAP or in Corpus Linguistics. And these are not either or situations. You might have had experience of the 2 or 3 of them, as it's usually the case. I mean, we have multiple identities. So what I will try and do in this hour or so is basically to try and cater a bit for the students who are here, for the teachers who are here, and for the researchers who are here. I hope that you will find something for you during the presentation. And I do hope, because I mean, the danger of doing that is that this may backfire and I may disappoint everyone, but I hope we don't get to that scenario. Now, one thing that irrespective of your experience, we all have in common is that we have we have language learning experience. So we've all learned languages. For most of us, this would be in the plural, as I said, languages, or at least one language. And we all have one shared language, which is English. And that's why many you are here today, because se eu começasse a falar agora em português, eu acho que só atenderia aquelas pessoas que estão no Brasil. So if you don't understand Portuguese, you probably didn't understand anything that I said just now. So just to highlight that, potentially the only shared language that we've got amongst all of us is English. And we can draw on that experience of learning English as a first language, a second language, a foreign, an additional language, so on and so forth. And this is what I would like you to do at the start of this presentation, to think about your English language learning experiences. So if you think about that historically, you might recognize some of the technologies you see on your screen. You might know the name, you might have used them, you might have seen them as a student, or you might have operated them perhaps as a teacher. I won't ask you to say which ones you recognize and which ones you don't recognize, because that would be quite telling about your age. And I'm obviously not disclosing which ones I know and which ones I don't know. I will probably just say that I don't know any of them. They are all new to me. But what we have in TESOL is that we use technology, and some of these we might not even recognize as technologies anymore. We have used them historically over the years, and one has replaced the other. One, we have had, let's say, the VCR, the video cassette recorder, coming and going, being replaced by the DVD player, and then we could name it. Now, if we think about computers, perhaps they are the ones that have been around for quite a long time in different shapes and forms. That's true, and it's not going to be the computer you see on the right-hand side of your screen, which is a quite old computer. We might be talking about more modern devices. So the computer, in a sense, or any of these other devices, are similar to the other ones in that they had an impact on what we do in our classes. They have had an impact on the pedagogical side of things. And last week we had the brilliant presentation by Peter talking about what we can do if we rely on these technologies, or better say on Corpus technologies, to teach and learn English. But the computer is also different from the other technologies I was showing you earlier on, because it has had an impact not only on what we do pedagogically, not only on what we do in a classroom as a teacher or as a learner, but it has had a huge impact on language analysis. It has helped us a lot to understand better what we do with language. It has helped us to conceptualize, and in some cases reconceptualize, how we see, how we understand, and how we theorize languages. I would argue that perhaps that is why the computer or Corpus technologies in a more general way have had such a long-lasting impact in the field. Although, as we saw last week, the pedagogical impact is still rather timid as compared to the impact it has had on language analysis. So that would help to explain the growth, the expansion of Corpus Linguistics. Primarily its impact on language studies, on linguistics, and there is lots of scope for that to be done in relation to pedagogical matters as well, for what we do in the classroom. But as Adriana was saying earlier on, my talk today has two components, so to speak. One is Corpus Linguistics, the other one is English for academic purposes. And here I'll be talking about English because this is the language that we share, but it could be applied to any language for academic purposes. It just happens to be that English is the language that we use in most cases, in most international contexts, for academic exchanges. Now, why has EAP grown so much over the years, and how can we explain the role that EAP has in our lives nowadays? Well, we just need to think about the internationalization of academia. So if we think about student exchanges, in the old days, students going to another university, spending 6 to a year in a different university, or even virtual exchanges that have always taken place and have been augmented by the pandemic. We also have to acknowledge the role of student recruitment in universities worldwide, trying to recruit, trying to get more students onto its programs. And here I'm not talking about universities where English, in countries where English is spoken as a first language, like the UK, US, or Australia, but I'm also talking about countries where English is not an official language. So Chinese universities are trying to internationalize their universities. They are delivering courses through the medium of English to get students, for instance, from India, Nepal, coming to their universities and doing a degree with them. We have the possibility of joint teaching or joint webinars as this one, where we've got people from all over the place, as you saw earlier on in the chat. There is this huge that is growing of transnational education, which can take different forms and shapes, one of which, for instance, is one university from one country opening a campus in another country, either on its own or in partnership with local universities. We used to have staff academic mobility before the pandemic, in the good old times when we were allowed to travel, when we could travel. And it's watch this space to see whether that's going to come back or not, because there are also environmental considerations in traveling around the globe. And we cannot forget the push for an international readership. So it's not uncommon that colleagues around the globe are invited, encouraged, forced to publish in English. It's not uncommon to hear of stories that people only get promoted in their academic contexts if they publish in English, that they only get grants if they have international publications. And then if you publish in one local language, that is restricted to that population that speaks that language. Whereas if you publish in a kind of international language, then your readership is larger. Now, this all helps to explain why EAP has grown a lot over the years. Before we move on, I would just like to highlight and to acknowledge the gatekeeping role that EAP plays. I won't be going into critical discussions of EAP here, but I thought I should just at the start really acknowledge that English for academic purposes functions in several contexts as a gatekeeper. So if you think of students who are studying through the medium of English, they show their knowledge through the medium of English. They might know the contents, but if they do not know how to express that in English, then they cannot evidence their learning if they're studying in countries where English is spoken as a first language. So I also talked about earlier on about some colleagues not getting promoted or not getting grants because they don't have international publications, because they don't have publications in English. So that's also a gatekeeping function that EAP plays. So if we acknowledge that, we need to be aware that we have to familiarize people with EAP so that they can succeed in their endeavors and what they're planning to do for their future. Now, you might think, can we escape academic discourse altogether? Well, not really. So as highlighted, sorry. Is there any problem? I can't see the chat, so if there is, just interrupt me.
Everything's fine, sorry.
All right, okay, that's fine. So you can't escape from academic discourse because discourse is really at the heart of what we do in academia. It is the way we collaborate. It is the way we create knowledge. It is the way that we educate new people coming into the university. It is how we review learning, we review who we side with and who we don't side with, and so on and so forth. So there is actually no way that we can say, well, I'm not going to be engaging in academic discourse. Before we move on, what I would like to do is to bring a bit more of interactivity to this presentation. So as I said earlier on, it's a completely different environment and here in that, all I'm doing is looking at my screen without seeing you. So I would, if I may, I would like to invite you to go to Slido now. So if you go to slido.com and you enter the code you see on your screen, 740824, or if you use the QR code at the top, I would like you to just type the kind of genres or registers that come to your mind when you think of academic discourse. So if you could just have a kind of thought shower now, and you can type in as many options as you wish. That would be great if you could do that, so that we could see what you think when we consider academic discourse. So yes, we've already got one answer there. You can type as many answers as you wish. And the more you type the same answer, we will be able to see how frequent that is. So just give you a few minutes now to complete that. it's great to see how this shapes up as you were doing that. So as you are in Slido, please don't close it because we will have more of that in the future. But meanwhile you are completing that, I will just go over what we see in the results in here. So it seems for most of you, the essay comes up as very frequent when you think of academic discourse, which is the prototypical way through which students would be evaluated at the university level. There are then lots of other different types of genres registers being mentioned in here. Several of them are written genres. So you were talking about articles, journal articles, abstracts, textbooks, research papers, grant applications, dissertations, theses, proposals, so on and so forth. Some of you are also mentioning spoken genres, spoken registers, like conference papers. I'm assuming that is being presented at a conference, seminar discussions. Can I see anything else spoken in here? Presentations, slides, and well, the slides in class wouldn't be spoken, but meant classroom teaching, yes. So you just see the range of different genres and registers that you came up with. So what I would like just to highlight, and basically that is something that we all know, but just to acknowledge that what we're talking about in here when we think about English for academic purposes, we're talking about academic discourses in the plural, as Batia proposes, because it's very difficult to conceptualize academic discourse as a single unit, as a single entity with an identifiable common core. Hanston also writes about that, acknowledging that academic discourse is a superordinate notion. And I really like Halliday's quotation when he writes that there is, of course, no single register of science. So we need to ask ourselves when we're studying English for academic purposes, what genres, what registers are we studying? And I'll come back to that later on. But this presentation, as Adriani was saying early on, is really about the interface of corpus linguistics, which I'm assuming you have some knowledge of, and English for academic purposes, which I'm also assuming you have some knowledge of, even if it is receptive knowledge, even if it is from the perspective of having studied English for academic purposes or having produced something in English for academic purposes. In the remainder of this presentation, what I would like to do is to focus on the questions I asked in the subtitle of my presentation, the what, how, and why. So if we move now on to the what is it that CL brings to EAP, teaching, learning, and research? And in discussing what we can do, I will be focusing on writing. So excuse if you were waiting for me to talk about some spoken discourses or computer-mediated discourses. I'll be focusing, given the hour I've got, only on writing in this presentation. And I decided to do that because writing is a higher stakes activity, as we discussed earlier on. This is the prototypical way through which students are evaluated. It is the prime way through which academics show knowledge, evidence knowledge, convey knowledge, share their findings with the community. So it is writing that has this most important gatekeeping function. Now, one area that corpus linguistics has helped a lot in relation to EAP is the production of vocabulary lists. So you might have heard about Coxhead's academic word list, which has been really influential in the field. It has influenced not only the research we do in EAP, but also the materials that are produced in EAP, because this provides a list of word families that are very common in a range of different texts from different fields. Now, as with any academic work, this is not without a criticism, and people have pointed out that some of perhaps the points that would require reconsideration in the compilation of the academic word list is the fact that it draws on word families. So the actual words included in those families might have different meanings, even though they're grouped all together. And it has also been pointed out that the use of West's 1953 word list as a kind of filter to the academic word list perhaps is not the most appropriate option. There have been other proposals of other general vocabulary lists like Gardner and Davis, who have used a completely different corpus, a much larger corpus, and a set of different methods from the academic word list. Now, one criticism that can be made, or that has been made in the literature of these general academic word lists or general academic vocabulary lists, is whether we can really talk about an academic core, whether we would have a core set of academic words that would be true, valid, important to everyone in all disciplines. So this has given rise to a number of discipline-specific vocabulary lists. So you've got here some examples from applied linguistics, chemistry, engineering, finance, medicine, and I could go on talking about, let's say, nursing, environmental science, so on and so forth. So these discipline-specific lists are a way to try and avoid that kind of criticism that, do you really have an academic core? Can we really say that, there is a set of academic words that are true, valid, used through all the disciplines? One point that has been made against the production of vocabulary lists is that we don't use words individually, as we all know since Sinclair's seminal work. The idiom principle does govern what we do and say. So in most cases, we will be saying or writing things that we have seen, heard, read before, and not necessarily these vocabulary lists highlight that because they focus on single words. So here's where I would like to shift from a researcher perspective into a practitioner perspective. As I said, I was trying to move around these perspectives in my presentation, just to give you an example of when these combinations might be relevant. So this is an example from a proposal that was written by a student, an advanced student of, a master's student who has an advanced command of English. And the student wrote, the questionnaires will be applied to postgraduate students in the 2015-16 academic year. So the question here really is, can we use apply with questionnaires? Is that the verb that you would use that would collocate with questionnaires? If we look this up in COCA, which has more than 1 billion words, we see that there are only 14 instances of apply plus questionnaire, which triggers some sort of rings an alarm bell, I would say. Why only 14 instances? Especially when we see that we're not short of instances of both apply or questionnaire. If we search then for verbs that are used with questionnaire, with the noun questionnaire, which is the third column you see on your screen, potentially the verb that should have been used in that example, a more common, a more natural way of saying that would be to administer questionnaires. So the questionnaires will be administered to students in the 2015-16 academic year, if I remember that sentence correctly. So this is just to give you one example that why you might have certain words, individual words, and vocabulary lists. We also need to look wider, and we need to look at how these words occur together. And there are proposals for academic phrase lists, for instance. And if you're interested in that, you can look that up. What I would like to do now is to move on to a different area in which corpus linguistics has impacted EAP. So if you could, I would ask you to go back to Slido now. So it's the same address and the same code, and decide whether this is true or false. So subordination is a feature of academic writing. Would you say it's true or false? This is potentially an easier question. There are only two options, so you don't have to type anything. All you need to do is to click them. And don't really think too much about it. What I'm interested in is really your reaction. I mean, if you had to make a decision now on the spot, would you say it's true or false? And there is no way I can track who you are. That's not going to be shared, so relax about it. It's anonymous, so I won't know what you have answered. We can only see the overall total on your screen as we go along it. Okay, it seems we have quite a consistent number of people, 83%, who are saying that, I mean, this is true. And yes, that is one idea that has been said time and again. That I would say is probably one myth about academic writing. We think that subordination is a feature of academic writing, but what corpus research shows us is that that's not really the case. Subordinators are rare overall in English. They appear most frequently in conversation and fiction rather than in academic prose and news stories. And this has to do with how complexity plays out in written discourse and in spoken discourse. In written discourse, complexity will be at the phrasal level, will be, for instance, you would have those very long noun phrases with lots of pre-modifiers. Whereas in spoken discourse, complexity will lie at the clausal level. It will be actually the clauses. So that's why it would explain that there are relatively more subordinators in spoken discourse than in written discourse overall. So this is an example of how corpus linguistics can also impact our knowledge, our understanding of grammar in EAP. For me, one of the key things that EAP can do in English for academic purposes is really looking at disciplinary variation, is really considering how things differ across the disciplines. And here I'm just going to be referring very briefly to a study I did in 2012 that looked at theses, doctoral theses, PhD theses, in two neighboring areas, English literature and English language, which in several departments around the globe would be sitting together under English, under languages, under departments of English and languages, or modern languages, depending on how that's conceptualized across the globe. But when we look at these theses, when we compare these theses, when we contrast one to the other, what we see is that in English language theses, there is a more patterned prose. People use the same words more often than in English literature theses, where they use a more varied lexicon. They use more different words. A higher number, better saying to avoid ambiguity, a higher number of different words in their writing. English language thesis has this methodological drive where people explain how they did things, what kind of materials they used, so on and so forth. Whereas in literature, what is foregrounded is personal experiences. And what comes to the fore is really expressions about life, death, love, so on and so forth. In terms of reference, we see that English language theses are characterized by texture reference. So it's almost as if the writer acknowledges that the thesis is a long genre, potentially one of, well, it is the longest genre that many students would write in academia. It is potentially one of the longest genres that would be written in academia. So in the UK system, we're talking about something that has over 80,000 words. And the use of textual reference helps the reader to navigate through this very long genre. Whereas in English literature, what we see is that personal reference comes to the fore, mostly through personal pronouns, mostly to refer back to previously named entities in the text. So that is, I mean, using corpus linguistics as a way of looking into specific differences is fascinating. It helps us to uncover things that perhaps we wouldn't have uncovered through other means. I won't have time to talk about everything that I wish I could highlight in here, but I would just like to point out other key areas that I see that corpus linguistics can contribute to EAP. So I talked about disciplinary variation earlier on, but there is also exciting research on interdisciplinary variation, looking at the differences when two papers, two publications, two written texts are from the same discipline, but they use different methods. The tracking of academic discourse through time has also had lots of studies recently looking at diachronic change, so how our use of academic discourses changes or doesn't change over time. Nessy and Gardner have done an excellent study on the BAW corpus, the British Academic Written English corpus, and they look at the differences across educational levels. More specifically, they look at the 3 years of undergraduate in the UK, of undergraduate study, of bachelor study in the UK, and 1 year of master's, with the exception of the dissertation that is done at the end of the master's. There is a whole body of research looking at English for academic purposes for speakers from different language backgrounds, and that has been facilitated quite a lot by, for instance, Corpora like ICO, the International Corpus of Learner English, compiled by Granger and colleagues in Belgium, and with collaborators across the globe. And there are also longitudinal studies, really important longitudinal studies. The example I'm giving here is one that has been conducted by Peter, looking at how EAP teaching can actually help students across time. So it is a fascinating area that has loads of, there is lots of scope for exploration. What I would like to do now is to move on to the how of corpus linguistics. And to get started with that, can I ask you to go back to Slido again? It's the same code, or if you have kept your window open, it will automatically update. What I would like you to do, it's the same word clouds we used in the first case. If you could just type the corpora that you have used to date. So which corpora have you used to date, or do you know about them? So if you could just type 1 corpus per line, that would be great, because then the word cloud will pick up those that are repeated. that is excellent to see. I mean, these words coming up and seeing, I mean, what corpora you have used to date. It seems that, man, for most of you, COCA and the Corpus of Contemporary American English and the BNC, the British National Corpus, come to the fore. You have also mentioned other different types of corpora in here, like academic corpora, MyCusp, MyCase. You have talked about corpora available in Sketch Engine, the corpus compiled by colleagues at Lancaster, the Trinity Lancaster corpus. You've mentioned do-it-yourself corpora, self-compiled corpora. Excellent, that's really good. So that will make my life easier, and it will also help me save time, because I'm just aware now I've got 15 minutes to finish the presentation. So yes, you can use general corpora to investigate English for academic purposes matters, provided that when you use a subset of that general corpus, a relevant subset. Be mindful of that subset, be mindful of what that subset represents and whether it can be investigated to the purpose that you want to investigate it. I don't think you have mentioned these two corpora from a suite of corpora, very excellent suite of corpora available from the Polytechnic University of Hong Kong. So if you're interested in English for academic purposes, you might want to look at them. You cannot download the data, but you can investigate the data online. And you have a corpus of research articles 2007, and then a similar corpus containing data from 2014. Some of you have mentioned these corpora, MyCase, MyCusp, representing data from the US, more specifically from the University of Michigan. Some of you mentioned Base and Bow, containing data from the UK, more specifically 3 universities in England. I don't think you've mentioned, unless I forgot that, Alpha and Relfa, which contains data from speakers of English as a lingua franca. And you can see that these corpora have 2 counterparts. You've got the spoken component and the written component. And they can be really helpful for us when we're investigating English for academic purposes through Corpus Linguistics, either for our own learning, for support for students learning or our teaching, or for research purposes. There is also the Wikipedia corpus. I mean, if we think about making academic knowledge available to the wider public, to how we can communicate this to the wider public. And so that might be interesting to look at. One corpus that I would just like to show you, and I thought I wasn't going to rely on technology. I'm not sure if you have heard of CARE, the Concordance for Academic Written English, which you see on your screen. And I've got a very short video that I will show you because I thought, well, I'm not going to play with technology if it doesn't work quite live. So what you can do here is to type any words. In this case, what I did was to type finding. And then I clicked on no pagination because I want everything in one page, and click on search. So here you have the results for finding, but you also have the categorization of moves. How has it been categorized according to moves? And here I'm referring to swales, moves and steps, which you can see here in this table, the codes that they use. And you can also look at a 3-sentence context. I thought if you haven't, if you are not aware of that, or if you have never seen that, you might want to explore that later on and see whether that helps you. Because one of the things that is very difficult to do with Corpus Linguistics is to integrate this kind of more qualitative analysis of moves and steps and a corpus investigation. So this might be helpful or might be useful to some of you. And you can also, I don't want to show the video again. You can also compile your own corpus, as you have said. I won't have time to talk about that, but this is something that we discuss in our forthcoming book. So we talk about the different levels of specialization that specialized corpus may have in English for academic purposes, and represent 25 criteria that might help students, practitioners, or researchers in compiling their own corpora. So in the remaining time I've got, what I would like to do is to move on to the why question, the final question I asked in the subtitle of this presentation today. So why should we bother in plain English? Why should we use corpus linguistics to investigate English for academic purposes? Well, I would say, first of all, because it helps us overcome our curiosity. And that is one thing that we shouldn't really forget, is being curious, asking, why is it being used? I mean, how is it used? What is used? And Corpora can help us answer some of our questions, some of our curiosity, some of the things that we don't understand about how language is used. Now, what's the impact that corpus linguistics can have on EAP? What does, or in other words, what does a CL perspective bring to EAP? I think the most important thing, or the one that has been discussed most often in the literature, is this methodological primacy. It's a change of methods. This has been, as I said, mentioned in the literature, but it has also been identified by end users, by people who are using corpus for practical reasons. The use of resources is also a really important point to make in here, because we can draw on computer tools to do repetitive tasks that we are not tailored to do as human beings, like counting, identifying, sorting, so on and so forth. And we can use our resources, we can use our human resources for higher order cognitive tasks. So we can focus our efforts on categorizing, on classifying the linguistic forms, for instance, that have been identified by the computer. Another important thing within this methodological paradigm is the use of data. We are able to use larger data. We can investigate larger data. This is not to say that we cannot investigate some small corpora. Small is also beautiful, especially in EAP, where we might be investigating specialized, specific contexts. We are able to investigate more diverse corpora, and we can reuse corpora. So when you were answering the question earlier on about which corpora you have used to date, several of you were referring to corpora that are available out there, that have been created and that are available to us as a community to make use of. Now, that methodological paradigm will have an impact on the knowledge sources that we use and that we draw on when we work with CL and EAP. So there is this move that has been mentioned in the literature several times, from intuition to evidence, from competence to performance. But what I would argue in here is that this has empowered us, the users, in the process of learning and teaching a language. If you've studied English as a foreign language, as an additional language, you might have heard things like, oh yeah, you said that, but it's not really the way we say it. So if, like me, have heard that, it kind of divides us into two groups, the us and them, and the person who hears that, who listens to that, who is told that, is not in the in group, is not in the we group. So what Corpora allows us to do is actually to investigate. So someone tells you this is not the way we say it, you can actually go there, investigate it. You can see whether the person who says that actually has a point or not, and we can learn from it. So there is a rule, a kind of a democratization rule in the use of Corpora in language teaching. There is also the thing that it is available there 24/7 for us to consult. We can investigate that at any point in time that we wish to do. Finally, both the methodological paradigm and the knowledge source have an impact on professional practice, have an impact on what we do in EAP. So things like frequency becomes an important factor, not the only one, obviously, to inform pedagogical decisions, but it helps us. We can raise users' awareness of language, but also users' awareness about language. One key aspect that has been mentioned in the literature several times, and that Peter alluded to last week as well, was the was autonomy, was learner autonomy, developing learner autonomy. So to go back to what I was saying earlier on about the use of general corpora and specific corpora, the use of the understanding of academic discourses and specific academic discourses, CL in EAP allow us to zoom in to look at specific registers and genres and investigate English for academic purposes, but it also allows us to zoom out and see what is there that may be helpful for English for general academic purposes. I'm aware I'm running short of time, so I will very briefly talk about linguistic imperialism. That means we have, or Corpus Linguistics have been accused of. I think here, and we can discuss that more in the Q&A if we have time, but it's not a matter of the method itself. It's a matter of the data that is being used. So I take that point. Now, if it's not a corpus of EL1 that should be used, then we do have corpora of English as a lingua franca that can be used for that purpose. So just one thing for us to keep in mind as we bring this to a close is that corpora won't allow us to do everything and anything. It will be helpful for some of the purposes we might have, but not all. And I think Hunston's words are really good, and here to summarize that all, just as it is ridiculous to criticize a telescope for not being a microscope, it is pointless to criticize corpora for not allowing some methods of investigation. Corpora are invaluable for doing what they do. And if you want to do something that they do not do, then we should find another way of doing that, and that's fine. So as I said earlier on, most of this presentation, or all of this presentation, was only on written discourses. I overlooked, didn't have time to discuss spoken discourses or what we call computer-mediated academic discourses. But I mean, if you're interested in that, our book is coming out in early 2022, and we discussed these 3 types of discourse in Corpus Linguistics for English for academic purposes, which has been co-authored with my colleague, Dr. Aisling O'Boyle from Queen's University Belfast here in the UK. So I will stop it here. Thank you very much for that, and I look forward now to our discussion.
Many thanks, Vander. That's a really good talk. So I'm going to take over for questions here, but actually, could you stop also sharing your screen just for 1 second, Vander? Just like to share just before people leave, just a wonderful segue that was provided for us by Vander about the lack of studies on spoken discourse, but it just so happens that next week we have Professor Michael Hoare of our University of Queensland who will be giving a talk on exactly that, focusing on spoken language corpora and second language pragmatics. So that's coming up next week. For anybody who has registered for this week, we do have a kind of different registration form that will go live next week. That should mean you only need to register 1 more time, I believe. But we'll start to advertise that as soon as possible. But yes, do look out for that. So in terms of the questions then, what we're going to be doing is you can ask your questions in the chat, either directly to me or through the public chat, or if you'd like to unmute your microphones and maybe turn on your video as well, then that's fine. I'm also going to stop the recording here the Q&A session, it will not be recorded. But for those people who are for those people who are watching the link on YouTube, it's great to see you. Do tune in again next week for the third session. And thanks to everybody who took part, and thanks of course to Vander for his talk today. So we're just going to stop the recording right here and get into the Q&A.